Hi, Pastor Nathan Decker with your hashtag Better Together devotion. One of the things that amuses me about American politics is that every single presidential election that I've been around, some party, someone is going to point to the other party, someone, and say, oh, you can't vote for him. He's the Antichrist. And seems like the American politics is so important to God's kingdom, apparently, that God has to have the right person elected, and he's counting on you. That doesn't seem to be what I read in the Bible, especially when I read about antichrists, plural. Notice that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So this language of those that are opposed to Christ, if you want to translate it literally, it's those who are literally against and opposed and opposite of the Antichrist. This language comes from the community of John. Now, John's community is the one that we get in our Bible, the Gospel of John, of course, but also 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, those letters, as well as the book of Revelation. Now, the writer was probably, I hate to burst your bubble, many different Johns. In fact, there's evidence actually that one of the 2nd John and 3rd John are actually two people who are writing against each other in a church schism, a church split. And because that's the community, that's what was going on inside of this community. There were folks who firmly believed that Jesus Christ was flesh and human. And there were other folks who firmly believed that Jesus Christ was not flesh and was not human. He was spirit only. And the Gospel of John tries to kind of say, oh, no, fully God, fully human. And there's a navigation there of this discussion. And then eventually there gets to be a schism. It's a church word for we just can't get along anymore. And they start breaking what in 1 John, they use the word koinonia. They break fellowship. They no longer show up at the table with each other. They no longer come to church. They no longer abide within each other as Christ called us to abide in the vine. But instead they have left and they've gone and they've started their own community of faith, their own church where they're preaching their own version of Jesus. Sound familiar? Yeah. So that's the context from which this language of Antichrist, the Antichrists, come from. So if I was to use a biblical understanding, looking at what was happening in the community of John, looking at what the language was that they were using, I would define the Antichrist not as some political leader who's going to announce and suddenly have 7 years of tribulation or 3.5 of good and die and then come back for 3.5 of bad. I wouldn't describe God's vision of the Antichrist in that way. Instead, I would describe an Antichrist as anyone seeking to harm the church, whether that's inside the church, as a part of the church, or outside the church, as somebody who's literally kind of an evangelical atheist who wants to do away with the church. Think Bill Maher with his understanding of religiosity, or the late Christopher Hudgens with his understanding that God is not great. These were folks who were literally on the outside of the church, attacking the church with an understanding of saying religion and faith is not a good thing. But there are also people on the inside of the church. And this isn't a new thing that Psalm 23 even imagines. He sets a table before me where? In the presence of mine enemies. The understanding in Psalm 23 is that the enemies are on the inside. They're sitting next to us sometimes. You see, if you are participating in being opposed to Christ's work, if you're being opposed to the kingdom vision, if you're not doing good, but instead are harming the church, well then, literally the community of John would be one who would call you antichrists. Let us focus not on trying to figure out who is or who isn't antichrists, but instead let us look at our own hearts and make sure that we are not doing harm, but we are moving the church forward, not from a place of fear. It's a steady course for me in this week, but from a place of hope, of love, a place that has encountered, has known, has seen, as the John's community says, has felt, and has expressed the Word made flesh. Jesus. Not some rule, not some theology, but Jesus is the Word. When we go through that understanding, we will be better together. Amen.